From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. As part of the new Bee Steward program here at Oregon State University, we have a number of field trips that we've been doing across the Willamette Valley looking at how people are establishing pollinator habitat. Our last session was on urban landscapes, and we had the good fortune to visit Pacific Landscape Management in Portland. I was really interested in talking with the staff there about how water rates are going up throughout the Portland area and how many people are starting to think twice about having a green lawn during the summer. Now, one option is just to leave that lawn brown, but clearly that doesn't offer many resources for pollinators, and you really don't get that delight of watching bees and butterflies and hummingbirds visiting your property. But our next guest doesn't think that that's necessary. Dr. Phil Allen is a professor of landscape management at Brigham Young University. He's a visiting professor at Oregon State University for the next 6 months, and he has some remarkable insights in which he's going to share in this episode from Utah about how to create very functional, ecologically sound alternatives to grass by taking lessons from subalpine meadows. This is a great episode because it's not merely conceptual, but Dr. Allen has experience installing these kinds of landscapes back in Utah. Finally, at the end of the episode, Dr. Allen reveals what he's doing here in Oregon. He's really interested in finding low water use alternatives to grass with ecological benefits here in Oregon. And so he's going to talk a little bit about how he's looking for working examples from all of you around the region about how you're making this work. And there's going to be some information on the show notes on how to get in touch with Dr. Allen. So I hope you enjoy the Rip Out Your Lawn and Create Something Cool episode of Pollination this week. Okay, well, welcome, Phil, to Pollination.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, Andoni.
I know. I have you here in person, which is like a wonderful thing.
Do you often do these remotely?
I often do them either remotely or in the field.
Right.
Rarely in my office these days.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and also, you're here from Utah. That's the other, added bonus is, I don't have to Zoom you.
Yes, I've been a professor of landscape management for 32 years at Brigham Young University. Mm-hmm. And I've done a few sabbatical leaves. I did one at Cornell, one at Minnesota, one at Gonzaga, and now I'm here. And I'm learning so much, and I'm loving the Corvallis summers. They're amazing.
It is a great summer, and it does make me think about, this time of year. It is beautiful. For those of you who are not from Oregon, no, it doesn't rain here all year long. That's why we have such a great seed industry. This time of year, we haven't seen rain for a few months. Maybe there's a couple drops on a Monday or something. And so unless people are watering their lawn, everybody's lawn here, brown, crispy. Maybe there's a couple of hawks. There's a couple of weeds that have deep roots that are green, but everything else is brown. And you've provocatively suggested that these crispy lawns are not inevitable, but could be replaced, get this, with alpine meadows. That's a wild idea. Tell us how you came up with this idea.
Well, Utah is the second driest state.
Oh, it is.
And
I didn't know that.
We have a huge environmental issue in that the Great Salt Lake is at risk of completely drying up. So we've got to conserve water. We've had an ongoing drought for a couple of decades now. And when the Great Salt Lake dries up, not only is there less water there for all of the ecological benefits that it provides, but a lot of the surrounding dirt becomes dust and it becomes airborne when there's wind. And it contains a lot of heavy metals, leading to major health challenges.
Really?
Throughout the greater Salt Lake Valley and the Wasatch Front.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So with that in mind, people are saying, well, I don't want to have a lawn. And a lot of what I saw was that people are just letting their yard die, which they don't go dormant and come back in the fall like they do in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
But they would die, and then, or they would rip it out and just throw in rocks and call it a xeriscape. It becomes very hot, often unattractive, and often filled with weeds.
Okay.
So for decades, I've worked on ecological restoration, and as a volunteer, carried out ecological restoration projects, and found that, we can have, with the amount of precipitation, which is roughly about 18 inches per year, I think about a third of what you get here, we can have green. And so the valley native flora is often brown come August, while vegetation up higher in our subalpine regions, 7,000 feet elevation, is beautiful through the summer. So we got the idea of bringing that ecosystem down a couple thousand feet in elevation and then watering it a little to keep it looking good.
That's great, and it's a fascinating kind of way of like looking at the entire ecosystem and sort of thinking, where's the green and how could this be brought in? And I guess many people I know, listeners of this podcast, have been anxious to take their lawns and transition them into meadows. But I guess this is different than an alpine plant community. And, so just maybe walk us through we're not talking about this classic, take out your turf, put in a wildflower mix. You're talking about something different, an alpine meadow community. Why do you think that's a better fit maybe for your region than a kind of like going in with the seed mix and just letting it loose? Well,
I learned from the reviewers. One was from Asia and one was from Europe.
Oh, this for the listeners who don't know, they were talking about an actual paper that you wrote.
Yes, it was a review article about using wildflower meadows as a template for water conserving landscapes. So we all have regional biases unless we're living all over the place, which I'm not. I've lived in the Midwest and in the Rocky Mountain region for a number of years now. And the term meadow means something different if you're in England or if you're in Asia than it does in the Rocky Mountain region. So I qualified this as subalpine, meaning you're up there where you get more precipitation, but it's definitely a Rocky Mountain look.
Okay. All right. And so, all right.
Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. Okay. So, but this, but this is different than, what I imagine some people in Salt Lake or Provo are doing, where they're just taking out the lawn and just putting some seeds down. There's something more intentional about doing an alpine system.
There are a lot of wildflower seed mixes. You can buy them all over the country. And my experience and observation has been that a lot of them look good for a year or two if you've properly got rid of the weeds beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
But then, because early successional plants are often easier to produce seeds of than climax vegetation, they tend to be biased toward plants that flower quickly and don't hang around for a long time.
Okay.
Or that themselves are somewhat weedy in nature.
Whereas an alpine plant community probably is a mixture of their early succession plants, there are plants that come in later, that there's a kind of, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure if we had a podcast on this, but the NRCS Plant Material Center here in Corvallis came up with a formula of 25% annuals, 50% short-lived perennials, and 25% long-lived. That you need to have some.
Right.
But in a plant community, you typically have all of those components kind of circulating.
Mm-hmm. So when you create a landscape, you have a semi-managed ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And it sorts itself out. Even mowed grass usually isn't just one single type of grass. Either there's several cultivars, cultivated varieties of perennial ryegrass or tall fescue, or there's a number of different species of grasses that just to the average observer are going to look green if they're maintained properly.
I'll be darned. Okay.
So a wildflower meadow like I'm thinking of is a complex ecosystem that you can't entirely predict because it's going to sort itself out based on the weather, the exposure, how much sunlight there is, and so forth.
Okay, so clearly, when in your context of thinking about bringing a subalpine meadow down into the valley, where and the way that I heard you talking about this is maybe a plant community that gets just a little bit more precipitation and bringing it down, and you'll add the precipitation in the form of limited irrigation. And then thinking back to that Great Salt Lake, you're going to allow more water to remain in there as a consequence. When thinking about that, clearly there's already, we've sort of been getting into it, there's some conceptual leaps that kind of thinking about all of these, that process that's going on. And I know in the paper you sort of boiled this down to 5 challenges.
Right.
Can we take those up? I think the listeners would love to hear about how to kind of turn their head a little bit to think about this problem.
Sure. The first problem, and this also applies to any landscape, is that the process of urbanization often results in construction activities that compact the soil and destroy the soil structure.
Okay.
When you have compacted soil, that means that air and water don't readily circulate, don't readily get into the soil. And so that restricts the number of types of plants that can thrive.
Okay.
Interestingly, turf, I've seen examples where people grow sod on top of a sidewalk. You can do that. And so grass often works well, whereas a complex meadow would not work well. In our system, there are a number of species of sagebrush. We recommend the lower ones for a homeowner's yard, for example, but the roots can go down several feet, but not if the soil is compacted. So soil compaction is the number one problem associated with trying to create an ecosystem. If the soil is too compacted, it won't support it.
I guess this maybe brings you to challenge number 2. Some people will deal with compaction by bringing in soil.
Exactly.
Okay.
So
what's wrong with that? Why is that a challenge?
Well, the first thing, and I didn't mention this in that article, but we looked at every topsoil supplier in the county and examined the soil for the presence of seeds, including noxious weed seeds.
Oh.
A lot of topsoils, say they were going to put in a parking lot for a Walmart.
Yeah.
They'd go over and scrape the top soil off, put it in a truck, haul it off, and sell it as topsoil, or they might even screen it.
Okay.
And it's full of weed seeds.
Yeah.
So we found that every commercially available topsoil had weed seeds in it, many of which were on the noxious weed list for the state of Utah.
Gracious. That's yeah.
In our ecosystem, when you increase fertility, you favor the competitive ability of weeds. So adding topsoil, while it's a good intention and you're trying to do the right thing, it often results in just the opposite effect where you get a whole bunch of weeds.
Okay, there's the weeds come in 2 ways. The first one that you just mentioned is, it may come in with the soil.
Right.
But you were also mentioning that there's a way in which the soil composition may give a competitive advantage to exotic plants. Say that a little more. Give us a...
Right. Certainly in the valleys surrounding the Rocky Mountains, there's a lot lower amount of topsoil, a lot more lower organic matter. And if you increase that organic matter, that tends to provide a more nutrient-rich soil, and that favors the competitive ability of weeds.
Okay. And so, all right, so you've got these 2 soil problems. are they solvable? Can you solve those problems?
Yes, and we have. We found that in highly weed infested soil, you actually have to control the weeds for 6 to, in my ecological restoration volunteerism, we control weeds for 18 months before we do an intensive planting. And the reason is, which relates to the next challenge, the price of native seeds can be outrageous.
Uh-huh.
High quality sagebrush seed can be upwards of $90 a pound. So what you often buy is low quality sagebrush seeds with a lot of chaff and stuff in it, so it's not so expensive. But if you have this very expensive seed, you can only afford to put it down at a certain rate.
Mm-hmm.
And if, for example, one of our major weeds is Bromus tectorum, also known as cheatgrass, and we have measured up to 50,000 seeds per square meter of cheatgrass. I don't care how expensive your seed mix is, you're not going to compete with 50,000 seeds per square meter.
So you really need to do weed management in advance, because you're going to be putting in a high investment, and if that that very precious sage seed goes in the ground and then is choked immediately, you've just defeated the purpose of the whole.
Right.
Okay.
And I think this is a good time to mention pollinators.
Okay, great.
Because, low diversity lawns that don't have clover or something in them don't support a lot of pollinators.
Yeah.
Just because they're mowed off. Similarly, as is happening all over the Salt Lake Valley and other dry areas, if you just put in rocks don't support a lot of pollinators.
Right, okay.
So a meadow, a high diversity meadow that includes grasses, wildflowers, and occasionally shrubs if they work, and occasionally a tree or two if they work, that's going to support a much more diverse pollinator habitat.
Okay, that's good, and it's good to state it, and I also imagine the other situation is you have grass that turns brown.
Right.
That's also there's no benefit there as well.
Right. My initiation into the world of native gardens was at the University of Minnesota, where I was attending school.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of guys had started a prairie design, installation, and management company that I was involved with for a few years. And we found that while a lot of people just wanted the flowers, they didn't want the grasses, when we just planted the flowers, they would fall over.
Mm-hmm.
We find the same thing in our subalpine and associated sagebrush steppe kind of ecosystems, that without the grasses, you don't tie up all of nature,
mm-hmm.
and that leads to vacancies for the weeds to come in. And they don't compete as well. But when you have a complex ecosystem, after 3, 4, 5 years, the ability for weeds to compete goes way down. Can I give you a specific example?
Please do.
We did a 7-acre site with our students using these exact principles. It was awarded a national award by the National Association of Landscape Professionals. And after putting in this beautiful wildflower meadow that saved 75% on water, the first year, the owner had hired students to pull cheatgrass. They pulled 24 black garbage bags full of cheatgrass. Year 9,
mm-hmm.
it was 1/4 of one bag.
Because those grasses established.
So the native grasses had established, where the weedy grass could no longer compete.
So giving it okay, that's good. That's great proof of principle that once these communities establish, it's the weed management after establishment really declines.
But in our click on the mouse and want an instant answer world, it's not. We have to be patient. These wonderfully complex ecosystems take what I'm hearing from our Oregon commercial landscapers. They take 3, 4, 5 years to really, really look good. And we've got to help people understand that patience is required.
Well, I think that's great, and I think there's, in my experience, the weed management on the front end people forget about, but this patience of allowing things to establish, allowing those roots to get down, to allowing the space to be filled out. That's going to take a little bit of time as well.
Right.
I did want to kind of circle back. This question of compaction. Is there, if you're bought a housing development, it's compacted soil, and you want to make a transition, is there anything you can do for that? That part I was a little less clear on.
Yes. First, prevention is better than fixing it afterwards.
Okay.
Conservation is better than restoration.
Mm-hmm.
So on the border of Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, there is a community, Kayenta by name, and it was built into a native landscape where the architects, the developers, were very sensitive to wanting to conserve that. So they began by saying, okay, we're going to only allow for the heavy equipment to go on the site where the footprint of the home is, where the driveway will be. So all equipment went over, in and out where the future driveway was going to be, and then a 6-foot area around the footprint of the home.
Mm-hmm.
So what did that accomplish? It prevented the compaction in the first place.
Uh-huh.
And so that's the ideal. If compaction has already occurred, it needs to be remedied. And in that case, what we often use are the same kind of implements that farmers do. Farming soils often will become compacted over the years. So you're actually going in and ripping it. If it's moderate to mild compaction, the soil can be aerated using the same kind of equipment we use in turf grass management.
Uh-huh.
In some cases that works. Or ideally, in my yard, for example, where I've also done this and watched it over 25 years now, it's a very rocky soil, and I chose to keep it that way. And rocky soils don't compact nearly as badly as a solid loam like most people would want.
Okay.
So it works out better that way.
Okay, well that's fantastic, and I guess coming back. Thanks for taking us back to the soil. Those are great suggestions. We have talked about the native seed, but I guess the other thing that we were talking about is, and I just want to kind of foreground this, is when you're planting in, we've talked about the need for grass, but you've also talked about the need for diversity, and that in many cases, especially in a farming background, you're used to putting in the same species in a row. And so having multiple species and having kind of thinking about the plants serving different roles in the plant community stability is, I guess that's what you were talking about with the grass, right. Incorporating bunch grasses.
Mm-hmm. And in a high diversity native plant community, you have seeds of various sizes and shapes. They germinate at different times of the year.
Mm-hmm.
They have different dormancy breaking requirements, mm-hmm. and on and on and on. So some seeds need to be seeded at deeper than 1 inch in order to germinate and establish well, while other seeds need to germinate at or near the surface. So if you have what I call an agronomic or a farm orientation or a row crop orientation mindset, you're going to fail to think about it in ecological terms.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you an example. In 2002, it's 20 years ago, Salt Lake City hosted the Winter Olympics. Prior to that, they decided to rebuild the infrastructure of the freeway system, mm-hmm. so that it would celebrate the landscapes, the aesthetic look of the valley and lower foothills. And I was brought in as the so-called plant materials consultant.
Okay.
And I developed 6 different ecosystems for that project. And the landscaper contracted to put it in said, you want me to seed 6 different depths and go pass over that 6 different times? That's not practical.
Mm-hmm.
The compromise was we had 2 passes, 2 actual different types of seeders, one at near the surface and one for deeper seeds, and they went over it twice and crisscrossed it a couple different times, and then they had some material that essentially raked it. And by doing that, it mixed it up enough to where we had really good establishment success.
Interesting. Okay.
So thinking about it as an ecologist, not a farmer, I guess that's one way of saying it.
Okay, that's good. And I guess the other way, strategy around this, and for people who are doing smaller areas, is to just have the plant in hand.
Exactly.
But plugs maybe in some cases rather than, because I imagine we have listeners out there who I'm just going to buy the seed pack, I'm going to clear some area, that they may be better ahead, putting their grasses in and putting their forbs, plugging them into a kind of patchwork. They may be better ahead.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
What we found in practice, and this goes again back to Minnesota prairies, where I first learned this, is grass seed is inexpensive, and therefore you can purchase enough that it comes up. You can put down enough seed to have a good stand of grass. We found that we would go in and put in the grass seed, plant the grass seed, but transplant in the forbs or wildflowers. The seed is much more expensive. A lot of it was still hand collected at the time rather than raised in a farm. And if the seed is costing you several $100s a pound, but it may only cost, $1 for us, what we called tubelings at the time. They're more than that if you buy them in a larger size, obviously. But then we could plug in the wildflowers. So that would be my recommendation, is seed the things that are easy to seed.
Yeah.
And a lot of good regional, local wildflower type companies can help you with that, knowing what works from seed and what would be better to get from a nursery. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg, unfortunately, because until the demand for the native wildflowers is there, the growers are reluctant to provide them.
Yeah.
And then the homeowner or person wanting to put in this meadow, they struggle with having access to them. So hopefully it's growing. I know it's growing. The demand is growing because in talking with a regional Western United States company, they're putting a lot more native seeds into farming production, so that brings the price down over time.
But still, I imagine even those are going to, these are not plants that are bred for seed production. It's a challenge.
Right.
You're always going to it's always going to be a little bit more expensive, and some seed is just going to be so hard to get enough of that you might be better off. I love that strategy that you laid out. You're going to start with the cheap stuff, and then you may, just to make that plant community more complex, if it starts to get pricey or it's hard to, it's iffy to germinate, go get a plug. And then that becomes a strategy to kind of be able to get it all tied together.
And I saw a graph. This was Portland area, not Corvallis, but of all the water districts in Portland over the last decade, what the cost of water was. And it's increasing faster than any other utility, even in a state as wet as Oregon. And so while, these wildflower mixes, the appropriate ones, and the strategies for putting one in, that's going to be a lot more expensive than putting in turf grasses. But the return on investment in water conservation, water savings over time should yield good returns.
Well, you and I it was funny, we were both at Pacific Landscaping.
Yes.
On the same day by coincidence. And, when I was talking to their staff, they were hearing, in the Portland area, water rates are going up. And some land management companies are doing just what you said in Salt Lake City. They're not putting rocks, but they're just letting grass go brown.
Right.
And that clearly there can be something much more imaginative that looks better, that's
Right.
more enticing than brown, just that kind of brown lawn, and one that serves other ecological functions.
So your episode number 75 podcast referred to ecological lawns or eco lawns.
Right.
I think that was 2018, if I remember right.
Yeah.
But the what we've learned more since then, and one of the main things we've learned is you need more than a handful of species to create the ecosystem that will work. I'm thinking a dozen to 20 plus species. Ultimately, not all those have to be installed initially, but in the long run, will create a much more effective and resilient ecosystem. And probably, correct me if I'm wrong, probably service a lot more pollinators because you have a lot more species-rich plant community.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the key thing, that there is both with our butterfly and moth species that need different host plants, but also all the the bees as well. They have different plant preferences, and if you have multiple families of plants, the odds are you'll bring more of them in.
Right.
Okay. Well. Oh yeah. So, I saw you. Have we covered most of the things here?
I think so.
Oh, you know what I did want to end on? It was the paper ends with the case studies. Now you talked about the successful award-winning design the students put in at Brigham Young University, but also there's a case study for a conference center. Can you walk us? You kind of tie all these principles together. Talk about what those projects look like before, what was done for site prep and ongoing maintenance. You talked about the cheatgrass pulling, but let's hear a little bit more about how those projects kind of came together.
Well, the first project was a residential 7-acre site, and that one we seeded it, and the owner of the property liked about 80% of what he had done. He didn't want fireweed that was 4 feet tall.
Right.
Which I fell in love with after Mount St. Helens blew. It was all covered with fireweed. It was gorgeous. But he didn't like it, so pulled all that. And we went back and reseeded some other things that after he'd spent more time researching, he said, I think I want that. I think I want that. And in a couple of areas, it simply didn't take. Near his driveway, there was probably more compaction, and we went back in and seeded some other things. And so over time, that worked. But again, it wasn't an instant gratification model. It was more of a complex, let's take a look at it and add where we feel there's a deficiency. And then over time, that becomes better. The other project that I included in that case study was the conference center above for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they had a significant rooftop garden, well over an acre, and they needed to vegetate it because there were very, very high-end residential properties that would look down on that, and they just didn't want to have high glare.
Yeah.
So rather than going with a Wasatch Front type of a native plant wildflower meadow, they chose to use a Midwestern prairie model. And the reason is the prairies consist of, C4 grasses. That's a little bit complicated, but their photosynthesis is such that they work better at warm temperatures. And in the Midwest, you count on summer thunderstorms for a lot of your precipitation. The advantage being they stay green all summer. You couldn't have something go brown and have the risk of a fire on top of a rooftop garden.
Yeah.
So they went with that model, and there's actually a number of papers published on that. And we just mentioned it. But that's an example of taking a different ecosystem and transplanting it where you need the summer green. And it has also worked out very nicely.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a quick break. We do have a segment that I'm curious to hear your answers to. We do with all our guests. So let's adjourn for 1 second.
Okay.
And the listeners will have a nice little song. So as we were talking at the break, as part of your sabbatical here, you've got this great idea for how to kind of kickstart research into eco lawns, or these kinds of like low growing in the front of your property green things, for lack of a better term. But tell us your approach. I love this idea.
So there's really an infinite number of possibilities, or close to infinite, when it comes to what might an eco lawn look like. That is a substitute for a lawn that stays green in the summer, requires less water, benefits pollinators, and is low growing. And rather than take the decades of research to try and figure that out experimentally, we're going to cast a net first through the greater Willamette Valley and say, do you have an eco lawn, or do you know somebody who has one? It's got to be good looking. It needs to have been in for 3+ years. We'd love to come take a look at it and capture your knowledge. And from that, write funding proposals that will guide our research going forward.
So kind of getting the ideas from what's already going on out there, finding the best examples, and then just back engineering it.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, so how are the people going to find out about this? Can they contact you directly, or?
I have, as long as I'm at Oregon State, I've got an email address here, and that's allephil@oregonstate.edu. But we'll put a link. Can we put a link on your summary of your podcast, and also put the solicitation on there?
The solicitation will be there. How to is going to be in the show notes, folks. So go to the show notes at the podcast, and you'll get all this. And we want lots of ideas. Let's get them flowing.
And I'd love to come visit you. If you've got something that works, I'm here for 6 months and love Oregon.
Well, what better deal is there, folks? So take it up. We're going to have it in the show notes, and you can get a personal visit to look at your lawn. And who knows, you may have the secret, or at least the start of the ignition point for kind of getting a super lawn going. So I love this.
Great.
Okay, now to business.
Yes.
All right, we do this as a way to kind of get to know our guests. And I guess the first thing that I want to ask you is if you have a book recommendation for the kind of stuff that we're talking about today. What would you tell everybody out there they need?
Sometimes it helps to read a book because it provides you with the ability to articulate a subject that you're passionate about but haven't thought through as well. So a book I'm currently reading is simply called Meadows by Christopher Lloyd. And it discusses a meadow from the perspective of England, Great Britain. But it uses a lot of strategy that I think we need in communicating to the public, because a lot of meadows don't look perfect all the time, and we need to change our expectations somewhat. So it's helping me articulate how to talk about a meadow.
I love books like that just kind of... it's maybe a topic that you know really well. This is an area of your expertise, but just seeing how people sort of develop the concepts and make them into a narrative, it's
right.
Very, very helpful sometimes.
Right. And when you write a book, it takes a lot of effort, and you have to really think through how to characterize what you're passionate about.
Well, thanks for that suggestion. That's really great. And I guess I don't guess. I know the next question is, what's your go-to tool?
My go-to tool is just being amazed. And when I don't know the answer, I find somebody who can steer me in the right direction. For example, a friend of mine put in about a 1-acre wildflower meadow and realized she wanted to supply more pollinators. She got into building blue bee nests, which I didn't even know what blue bees were, but they're really cool. She has her garage full of them in the wintertime.
Yeah. Just
drill a hole in these little boxes, and they're out there, and the blue bees come out and they do their thing, and they help.
Oh, it's amazing. But yeah, that is, an amazement does a kind of like natural curiosity. Because I was thinking about, we were talking about creating a plant community way out of a context. It's not since the last glaciation sort of sorting itself out and whatever, you're kind of having to pay attention to a lot of little details and a lot of moving parts. And I don't know how you would do that. There's no overriding principle, I guess, sometimes, that there are general rules or laws of, ecological functions, but you almost have to keep your eye open, I imagine. You have to be curious. You have to ask questions. Did you grow this before? I had a bad experience. Did you have a bad experience? Right. Like nobody, or you find that I sometimes find there's a plant I really like, and it's like, I had a bad experience with it. And then I talk to somebody who says, no, it germinates all the time. And then it's just a pack of bad seed. But you, without kind of like, if you stop at the first estimation, you miss much.
Yeah. Good point.
Okay. Now for the last question. Do you have a favorite pollinator species?
This is going to be, again, a complicated subject because my favorite pollinator is also my most hated pollinator.
Uh-oh. All right, let's hear it.
It is called the hawk moth, also known as sphinx moth.
Yeah.
And I am a passionate person when it comes to the genus Penstemon. There are about 115 species, and my colleague Michael Stevens just produced a book on Penstemons. It's a beautiful $60 book. Well, I, in the evening, will go out into my yard and watch my Penstemons, and these, what I originally thought were hummingbirds, were these moths flying around and pollinating my Penstemons. I go, rah, 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 go hawk moths. Well, also known as tomato hornworm, they were destroying my tomatoes. So it's a love-hate thing.
Oh, well, I suppose. But wait a sec, there's a new book on Penstemons?
Yes. It is by Michael Stevens. I can't remember who published it, but the day before he retired, I handed him $60 and he handed me a book.
Fantastic.
So I got mine directly from the author.
So it sort of tell us a little bit about this book. Is it talk about the whole group? And
yes, Michael Stevens was a very passionate photographer, nature photographer, and in his month off during the summer, he would go out and hike and wait for that perfect moment to photograph Penstemon plant up on top of a mountain or in the desert or wherever it was. And he just compiled all these, and with the help of some botanists, created a lovely story book. It's more of a coffee table book. It's large, but it's about Penstemons.
Fantastic. Well, we'll track that down and put it in the show notes. But it has been a true delight talking with you this afternoon. And I just want to remind our listeners to make sure to, if it wasn't clear in the 3 times I stated to you, you're going to have an opportunity to submit your own great experiments in creating green lawns, eco lawns, while you're studying here. So,
and we hope to carry this work on into the future, because whether we call them a wildflower meadow or an eco lawn or a refuge lawn like they do in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, it's the same idea of a complex, diverse ecosystem that provides a number of services. We call them ecosystem services, and is also beautiful.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button, where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.